Tonight we have a very special guest, Mr. Wirbel from the ACLU and the Pikes Peak Justice Commission.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Go ahead and give the floor to
Well, I don't know if you saw the blurb, but this isn't going to be about dissecting the Patriot Act little piece by little piece. Instead, it's going to be about looking at everything that happened from September 11th legally around the Patriot Act and all these other laws and executive orders that took place, and how attorneys and enforcement agencies managed to combine all these laws to do raids and to do lawsuits to be able to kind of narrow down and nab a few people. Originally, they started out going carefully aimed toward just what you would define as a terrorist community. And slowly it morphed into this thing where it became a racial profiling for anybody Islamic. And then it morphed once again so that they started targeting anyone who was involved in labor protests or peace protests or any of that. And none of that should have been a surprise, because that happens about every 30 years or so in American politics, and it's happened virtually since the time the Constitution was ratified. Something scary happens. You get a bunch of people operating out of fear. They create a bunch of crazy-ass laws. The laws get expanded. And then as a result of that, they get too crazy to be able to be supported. And people say, oh, we can't have that. The laws get taken in again. And sure enough, 20 years later, the same damn thing happens again. So what we're seeing with Patriot Act is something we've seen time and time and time again since the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1790 or whenever they were. A little word about where I come from. I've been interested in the work of the ACLU and interested in the work of the intelligence agencies since I was in high school in the late 1970s, and I did an internship with the ACLU studying something called the Law Enforcement Intelligence Unit. And this was a private club of police department intelligence agencies that operated nationwide, and now they operate worldwide, and they were able to swap information that you couldn't ask for from your Freedom of Information Act because they were a private club. And at the end of the 1970s, no one knew who the LEIU was, and nowadays, 30 years later, they're still around, and no one knows who the LEIU is. So that taught me at a very early age, you can have laws on paper, but the police agencies, the intelligence agencies, will always find a way to get around those laws and do what they really want to do anyway. In the time of the 80s and 90s, I got more into looking at the military and intelligence end of things, and I wrote a couple of books on the intelligence and military budget combination, but then got hammered home the importance of the work of the ACLU and the work of civil liberties just about 10 years ago exactly, when the Denver police was forced to release its spy files. And it turns out this gentleman here, Bill, and I had spy files. They were some of the biggest in the state, after Glenn Morris and Ward Churchill and some of these people. And it wasn't because we were going around doing anything insurgent. We had been given talks about Buckley Air Force Base in Aurora up in Denver, and how it's one of the major intelligence bases of the Western Hemisphere, and about the support work done at Schriever and Peterson here. And we had foreigners at some of these meetings, people from England and Germany, and they thought, oh, intelligence bases, the speeches, foreigners, terrorist threat. And so immediately they started, taking everybody's license plate numbers and all this kind of stuff. And these files were released. I've been passing around some of the Denver police spy files. They're actually more humorous than they are anything else, because we never saw a dime, just a cheap little apology to say, oh yeah, we won't do it again. Yeah, right, you won't do it again. Give us 6 months, you'll be back. We know. It was the same old, and so nothing was too shocking, except you always have to remember your capability to potentially be shocked, or otherwise nothing will bother you anymore. And the police will get away with murder, which is what they've been doing. Now, it's interesting that the police files came out before September 11th and right in the middle of the Clinton administration, because it's really important to understand that a lot of this stuff predates Bush's election, and really some of it goes back to Reagan. I mean, Clinton had a real favorite tool he used, called the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. And the first one of these Joint Terrorism Task Forces actually went back to the Reagan days, but Clinton loved them. And in Clinton's era, we only had to worry about 12 or 15 of these things. Now, there are over 100 Joint Terrorism Task Forces around the United States that have representatives from the FBI and the other intelligence agencies and state and local, law enforcement, trading information on a way that is outside the boundaries of freedom of information, just like LEIU. And so all of this was kind of well on its way in the Clinton era. Some of you might be aware that during the election with George Bush, some of the Republicans like Dick Cheney and Richard Pearl, a few others, were in a group called Project for a New American Century. And they had a framework of what they wanted to see that really duplicated everything that was in the Patriot Act. So they had everything ready to roll, looking for an excuse to get it rolling. And of course, September 11th provided them the perfect excuse, because at that point, everybody in Congress was operating from a position of total fear. You saw things like renaming French fries in the cafeteria the Freedom Fries because we don't like the French anymore. I mean, this was the level of debate. I shouldn't make too much fun of it, because today, with the stuff on detention in the NDAA bill, they're just as lunatic. But here we had members of Congress not reading these bills, not understanding anything, voting on anything through fear. But I'll go through a couple of the elements of USA Patriot and then kind of explain how they move outward from there. One of the things they said about USA Patriot is we want to change all the words of something called FISA, the FISA, and that's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And the thing they talked about publicly with FISA is they wanted to change the way that people could do individual wiretaps on you, just on one single individual. So they had things like roving wiretaps. They wanted to be able to track an individual across multiple cell phones and all this kind of stuff. So they said, well, we're rewriting FISA, which was true. But they went through something else later on in the Bush administration called FISA bypass. And I'm going to spend a few minutes later on talking about that, because it's something important, something that most members of Congress don't even get, something that almost none of the American people get, that represents both the scariness of the technology and also the degree of fraud to which the government regularly goes to. But we'll revisit that in a minute. In the original Patriot Act, they changed FISA all around so they could do more effective snooping on individual phone lines. And they also they improved the warrant process by doing something called a sneak and peek warrant, which means you didn't really have to ever admit you were going into somebody's house or looking at their computer, and you didn't have to leave a business card anywhere or anything. You could just wander in and look at this. And there was an element called Section 215 that said you no longer had to look for specific things. You could, in a search warrant, ask for virtually everything that you said might be terror affiliated, which might be records of phone calls, objects. Yeah, there was a famous case in one of the political party conventions where they considered puppets, giant puppets, to be a possible object of terror. And so, sneak and peek warrants even applied to puppets. This is the kind of, crap we always go through with this. A lot of other things within Patriot Act were very specific. You had a whole section for anti-money laundering, and you have an entire intelligence network almost no one knows about called the FinCEN network that's just to track your money going around. There was a border security thing where the Attorney General could work with what was then the Immigration Service and later became Homeland Security to get involved directly in any kind of alien thing that might potentially involve what they called terror. And of course, what they called terror changed all the time. And you had the ability of the Justice Department to make what they called rewards, which was really just flat-out bribery all the time, whenever they wanted to, if amounts up to, I think like $500,000 or something. It was just outrageous. And you changed the definition of terrorism as an element of criminal law. And a really important thing that nobody figured out the meaning of right away was the ability of the Attorney General to look at any element of military intelligence that he wanted to, and we'll get back to that. But a real critical part of Patriot Act that was kind of separate legislation but was related to all of it was something called a National Security Letter. And the first national security letters came around in, like, I think 1978, so it'd been around a long time. But with USA Patriot, the number of national security letters went up into the hundreds of thousands issued to people. And what these got issued to was folks like bookstores and libraries. And they would ask for lists of books or whatever that a particular person had checked out or whatever, and it could be anything related to a particular individual. If you want to track what that individual was doing, you could just issue national security letters before it. And an important difference with the Patriot Act is the national security letter now came with a gag order, which meant that if you were a librarian and you got a national security letter, you couldn't even announce to anyone you had received a national security letter, or you'd be guilty of a felony. So no one had any way of tracking who it was that received these national security letters until finally a very brave group of librarians called the Connecticut Four, took a whole lawsuit case then. And when they revised the Patriot Act in 2006, they changed a lot of these gag orders so that people could finally say out loud. They couldn't say what they'd gotten it for, but they could say, guess what? I just got a national security letter. I might have cooties. You might want to stay away from me. It's like, and beforehand, they couldn't even admit to that much. So this was a very, very big omnibus type of thing that was being presented to people. It was right after Patriot Act came out that two new agencies came in to help control all this. Everything regarding like FEMA and immigration and all that fell under this monstrous Department of Homeland Security. And I would say it hasn't gotten more scary since it became Homeland Security. It simply has become more bureaucratic. It's like this kind of great big monolith that Janet Napolitano now has charge of. And she's just as awful in dealing with immigrants as any of the old INS directors now, except that now she has FEMA and all these other agencies under her. But it doesn't mean that Janet has become a super intelligence agent. It just means she controls a big bureaucracy with a lot of money that ends up giving a lot of money to a lot of other people. And then there was another thing started called the Office of National Intelligence, which was essentially another bureaucratic element to try to get the FBI and the CIA and the NSA to stop fighting. And it didn't work because it kept fighting anyway. So it was another way to spend and we're talking hundreds of millions to billions of dollars as all these agencies started expanding their domain. In fact, one thing that made me really frightened around the time Cheney went for his power play in 04-05 was that once the executive branch expands its domain, nobody in their right mind is going to want to pull it back in because it means taking away their own power base. So I remember thinking when all the, competition between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama was going on in 2008. Well, it doesn't matter which one wins and whether McCain or them win because none of them are going to want to pull back the power base that Cheney pushed out to begin with because you've got a bureaucracy that tries to defend itself. Ultimately, Obama could talk about anything he wanted to as far as respecting civil liberties or stuff. But once that money was on the table and he saw the size of the cabinet agencies he could control, he said, no, that's not of interest to me to shrink myself back down again. That's not where I'm coming from.